Well, hey, like I said, my name's Adam. I'm our lead pastor here. If we've not had a chance to meet, I would love to say hey to you on the way out the door today. I'll be in the back and would love to get to know you, hear a little bit of your story and how you ended up here. But, man, I don't know how today is going for you or how your week has been. Anybody ever have those weeks where it's like everything's just crazy? It's out of control. That's been my week this week. And so what I'm talking about today, I feel like God's like, Adam, listen to what you're saying because you are teaching yourself today. We're talking about the difference between control and self-control in this series that we've been in called Under the Surface. It's where we're taking a look at the things that exist beneath the surface in our lives, and when we don't pay attention to them, they always have a way of affecting everything else above the surface. So let me start with this question this morning. Have you ever had to do something that you didn't want to do? Yeah, you ever had to do something you didn't want to do? I mean, that's like a rhetorical question because the answer is yes, right? Like, we've all had to do stuff that we didn't want to do. But have you ever had to do something like you really, really, really didn't want to do? Like to the point you put it off for like, I don't know, like 10 years, right? For me, that is going to the dentist. I don't know what it is, but it's always freaked me out. And I had a dentist as a kid that didn't want me to eat candy and then would shame me when I ate candy. He was like, Adam, were you eating candy again? I'm like, yes, sir. And I would like kind of curl up and cry or whatever. But that might have something to do with it. But even today, the thought of going to the dentist, like, man, I just cringe under the surface. I'm like, I don't want to do anything with it. But I put off getting my wisdom teeth out for like 8 years. They told me back in high school I should do it. Then they told me in college I should do it. And then I was like, no, I'll be all right. And then things finally got so bad that I got to a point where I was like, I need to make it happen. And then my wife was kind enough to get some footage of me waking up after wisdom tooth surgery. Check this out.
You had to get your teeth out. Here, turn this way. Scoot that way. You feel okay? You hurt? Does your mouth hurt? Do you know why? I don't know what you're saying, so just be quiet for a minute, okay?
No, that's a bad idea. That's a bad idea.
Do you still see the clown?
Mickey the Clown, he's
I
here.
don't know who Mickey the Clown is. Okay. They're your teeth that they pulled out.
That's why I am doing
Yeah, that is why you're at the dentist. I'm gonna go get the car, okay? And they're gonna bring me down. I know. I'm gonna leave for just a minute, okay?
You can hang out with me,
Okay.
okay? And I'll bring you down.
Okay.
Sound like a plan?
Yeah.
I love you. Can I have your teeth? Okay, I'll give them to you when we get home, okay? Okay? See? Why did you say a bad word earlier? What did you say you did today? You read Revelation.
And we don't have to be afraid of dying. We have to be better.
It's true.
That made me feel better than I
That's good. God is pretty cool.
I got my wisdom teeth on today. I was supposed to do a long time ago.
Yeah?
Yeah.
You still look pretty cute though.
I had to help cook it.
Do you remember anything you said after your surgery?
What did I say?
You asked me if I had something.
Oh, yeah. Anybody else in there?
Do you remember asking me that?
Anybody else in there?
No. Are you kind of coming back to now?
I feel better.
You feel better?
I still hurt though.
My eyes are just crazy in that video. I'm like, oh my gosh, that's a man who's out of control there. But what didn't make the cut, thank God, was some things like when Ashley goes, you remember what I said? It was just wildly inappropriate. Just go with that, all right? We had to edit it out. And apparently the reason I wanted to keep my teeth, Ashley told me, is because I told her I was going to make a trophy out of them. And I saw a clown at some point. I apparently was saying lots of bad words because I wanted to, is what I told her. And then I was talking about the book of Revelation like a crazy man there in part of the video. But here's the thing about that video. That was 10 years, 8 to 10 years in the making. I just kept putting it off until it got so bad that I had to do something about it. So here's a few lessons for you when it comes to dental work, all right? The first thing's this. If they put you out and put you under, like with pain meds, don't let anybody around with a camera because you'll look like that, and then it'll end up showing up somewhere, right? The second thing is, do it when they tell you to do it. Like, I just need to get my wisdom teeth out the first time. And everything that I tried to hide beneath the surface, it clearly came up above the surface, right? Like, I had to deal with it. And then the third thing that I learned in this was this. The real reason I didn't want to get my wisdom teeth out was because I was afraid. Because I was afraid. It was fear. Which sounds silly, right? But I know we've all been there. What I ended up doing in my life was I just shoved that fear down beneath the surface, thinking I wouldn't have to deal with it. But eventually it made its way above the surface and turned everything into chaos. And that's kind of what I want to talk about today. See, fear, it's a normal human emotion that we all deal with. So let me ask you a personal question. What are you afraid of? What are you afraid of if you actually think about it? Is it a fear of spiders or snakes or bugs or heights? Maybe it's a phobia, or maybe you're a Razorbacks fan, and I've talked to some of you, and you go, I'm cautiously optimistic, but I'm afraid to put too much hope in the Razorbacks this season until they prove it, right? Or if you're like me, maybe it goes deeper than that. Maybe it's the fear of what's going to happen in your marriage or in your finances or with your addiction or with your job. Or maybe it's fear that life will never be the same on the other side of whatever it is that you're facing right now. And here's what's true about fear. Fear is a normal human emotion. And in the church, sometimes we go, man, fear's a bad emotion. It actually isn't. God gave us fear and all of our other emotions. They're not good or bad. They actually tell us something that's happening in the world. God designed us to feel every emotion that we feel, including fear. But here's the thing. What can absolutely define our lives is how we react to those emotions, right? How we react and respond to those emotions, and whether or not we choose to dig beneath the surface of our lives to find out why they're coming up and why they exist. And so when it comes to fear, we have a couple options, and this is how it typically goes for me. See if this plays out in your life this way, if it resonates with you. When we're faced with fear, we can either turn to one of two things. We can turn to control or self-control. Control or self-control. Control is what takes place above the surface. It's when we attempt to manipulate our circumstances or the people around us to lead to the best possible outcome for ourselves. That's control. But then self-control, it's actually what takes place below the surface. It's not affected by our circumstances. It's actually what the Bible would say is a fruit of the Spirit. It's a result of God's work in our lives. Self-control is a steadfastness and a composure and a self-mastery that goes beyond our circumstances for the good of others and the glory of God. And here's what God promises us in those moments, is that it's actually good for us as well. See, our control is based on what we do, right? It's what we can control. And it's based on the circumstances above the surface. But the problem comes in when we realize this. There's so much of our life, it's out of our control, right? It's out of our control. And I don't know about you, but the primary thing that can lead me to try to control everything above the surface, all the circumstances of my life, it's this. It's fear. It's fear. So take fear as an example, right? Fear, it can actually be used to drive us towards control or to self-control even. God can use fear in a really good way in our lives. Think about this. Fear can lead us to trust our spouse and their intentions. That's self-control. Or it can lead us to be manipulative and demanding. That's control. It can lead us to seek help with the addiction. That's actually self-control to go, I can't do this on my own. Or fear can lead us to a place where we go, I can do it on my own. I've got this. I'm going to hang on to control. Fear can actually lead us to parent our kids and point them towards the grace and truth of Jesus when they mess it up along the way. That's self-control. Or fear can lead us to power up and try to control the situation. Or it can lead us to turn a blind eye and passively say something like this, kids will be kids. which is a form of control when you think about it. It may not feel like it's control, but it's actually running away from the problem, which gives you a sense of control. Why? Because it's for the benefit of yourself, not for the good of your kids. And so today, we're going to take a look at the story of a guy named Jonah. And his story is found in the Old Testament. You might have heard of Jonah's story before. He's the dude that got swallowed by a giant fish, and then he lived to talk about it. We're going to get to that here in a minute, but throughout Jonah's story, what we're going to see is that he was faced with fear. And we're going to see what happened in Jonah's story as he tries to take control of things that actually are out of his control. And we'll see what happens when he, in that place of having no control, chooses to step into self-control. But then at the end of the story, what we're going to see is this, that it doesn't have this nice, neat bow on the end of it, because at the end of the day, like you and me, Jonah still doesn't get it right. He still doesn't get it right. And so there's a lot of hope in this story. I think we're going to be really encouraged by it today. But what we're going to find out on the surface is that God is going to ask Jonah to do something that he really doesn't want to do. So let's check this out in Jonah chapter 1, verses 1 through 2. It'll be up here on the screens. You can follow along if you've got your Bible. Jonah's in the Old Testament if you want to turn there, or you can just Google Jonah on your phone and it'll pull it up. I'm going to read some passages. I'm going to story tell some sections in between, and we're going to cover the whole 4 chapters today, all right? So the word of the Lord came to Jonah in Jonah chapter 1, verse 1. And he said to Jonah, "Go to the great city of Nineveh and preach against it, because its wickedness has come up before me." So before we move on, it's important to understand who Jonah is and who the Ninevites, the people who live in the city of Nineveh, are. So Jonah, he's like this religious dude. He's actually known as a prophet. He knows all the rules. He knows how to dress all the right ways. He knows how to say the right things. And his job as a prophet is to hear directly from God and then go tell people what God is saying to him and to them. Now, think about that for a minute. Like, pause on that for just a second. Jonah actually heard the voice of God. Jonah heard from the God that created everything. And he knew what God's will was for his life and for the world because he heard directly from God. I don't know about you, but I've never had that happen in my life. I've never heard directly from the voice of God. But what we're going to find in Jonah is even in somebody who hears the voice of God in his life so clearly, he's still going to struggle to trust and obey, as we're going to find out here in a minute. See, what God wanted to do through Jonah was he wanted to send him to Nineveh, and he wanted to give them a second chance, a chance to change. We're going to see that here in a few verses. But here's what you need to know about Nineveh. Nineveh was a large city in the country of Assyria, and it was possibly one of the largest metro areas in the world at that time. But Assyria, man, they weren't just a country. They were an empire that was out to conquer the world. They were the enemies of Jonah and the Israelites, and the conflict between Israel, where Jonah was from, and Assyria, it was only getting worse. In fact, there's a prophecy in another part of the Bible that tells us that one day Assyria would conquer Israel. And not only were the Assyrians one of the most powerful empires in the world, they were one of the most cruel and brutal. In fact, they were known for cutting off the heads of their enemies when they conquer them, and they put them on stakes outside cities, or they would pile them up in pyramids outside of conquered cities. Like, they're just brutal. Their kings would cut off the skin of enemy soldiers, and they would hang it from the walls of a conquered city. Like, that's just a few light examples to get you going here on Sunday morning, right? Like, not too heavy. But here's what God is asking Jonah to do. He's asking Jonah to go to Nineveh, right, where he's an enemy, and to tell them that God has a better way to do life for them. How do you think that's going to go? Like, for Jonah, it's going to take incredible self-control. It's going to require a steadfastness, a composure, and a self-mastery that goes beyond Jonah's circumstances walking into Nineveh. See, God's asking Jonah to work for the good of his enemies and for God's glory, not his own good or for his own glory. And God promises in the middle of that, Jonah, it will be good for you. But what Jonah chooses to do next, it kind of makes sense to me. And I bet it makes sense to you too, because if God asked me to go to Nineveh, to do something I really didn't want to do, it's what I often do when I face fear. I try to take control. Verse 3. But Jonah did what? Ran away from the Lord. It's all right to talk. It'll be more fun if we kind of talk back and forth, right? Like, Jonah ran away from the Lord, and he headed to Tarshish. We'll talk about that in a minute. He went down to Joppa, where he found a ship bound for the port of Tarshish, and after paying the fare, he went aboard, and he sailed for Tarshish. That's weird to say 3 times in a row, to flee from the Lord. So Jonah hears God say, hey, go to Nineveh, and he goes, no thanks. I think I'll pass on that one, God. I'll go to Tarshish instead, which if you look at a map, Tarshish was 2,500 miles in the opposite direction. You can go ahead and put that map up, Austin. It was 2,500 miles in the opposite direction of Nineveh. Tarshish is a town across the Mediterranean Sea in what is known as modern-day Spain, and it was kind of known as a resort town. So while Jonah's being asked to go to his enemies, he goes, God, I think I'll take a vacation instead. I'm going to try to run away from you. Now, every time I've heard this taught, I've heard that Jonah was just simply disobedient, and he should have obeyed God, right? And there's no doubt that he was, but I think there's actually more at play here beneath the surface that we can identify with in our own lives. Because beyond disobedience, I think you and I can know what Jonah's going through here. Jonah's afraid. He's afraid to go to Nineveh. I mean, remember, they cut off their enemies' heads, and they skinned their enemies, and they've been at war with Israel. Maybe he's even lost somebody that he loves in that war. Maybe he's had a family member or a close friend killed by the Assyrians. I mean, wouldn't you be afraid too if you were in Jonah's spot? And out of fear, Jonah chooses to take the situation into his own hands. He chooses to take control. In fact, in the original Hebrew, the writing implies that Jonah didn't just pay for a ticket on a ship to Tarshish. He actually paid to take control of the entire ship. He basically rented out the ship for his cruise to Tarshish. He attempted to manipulate and control the circumstances and the people around him in order to lead to the best possible outcome for who? For himself, right? And that, by definition, is control. Jonah takes control, or so he thought, because fear has this funny way of tricking us into thinking that we have control, right? It's actually a false sense of control. Because as we're about to find out, running from God and thinking that we're in control, it actually leads us to find out we aren't in control to begin with, because God's everywhere. You can't really run away from him. Verse 4, then the Lord sent a great wind on the sea, and such a violent storm arose that the ship threatened to break apart. And all the sailors were afraid, and they cried out to his own God, and they threw the cargo in the sea to lighten the load of the ship. I mean, as it turns out, did Jonah have any control of his situation? No, right? None. And isn't that what fear tricks us into doing? See, fear, it blinds us, and it tricks us into believing that we actually have control. And in Jonah's case, control looked like running away from God or thinking that he could, which it sounds crazy sitting here in a comfortable spot to think that we could do that. But when you're faced with fear, I don't know about you, but sometimes I found myself trying to run away, just trying to get away from God. I don't know about you, but every time I've tried to take control, what I find is this, that my life actually gets pretty out of control as I try to hold on and keep control. And it actually leads me right into a storm. That's my story. And I know some of you have heard parts of my story before, but I'm going to share more of it with you here today. And we say this around Hope City, like we are all in the same boat. I talked about it a little bit in the intro, but man, we want to create an environment where you don't have to fake your way through life. You can actually bring it in here. You can lay it before Jesus and see if he actually has a better way to do life, if he wants you to experience a better way to do life. And we can say we are all in the same boat around here because it really is true. Me too, all right? Anything that you're facing, anything you're going through, I've probably been through it before. And so what I want to do is share some of my stuff with you this morning. And I'm going to trust that you're going to make this a place for me to process through some stuff and then get to know Jesus in the middle of it. Does that sound all right? Can we do that this morning? So my story, back in high school, and fear of missing out or feeling like that I just wasn't enough and wanting connection, to be honest with you, I started sleeping with my girlfriend. And what I could say in that point in my life is I took control. I ran hard from God. Like I knew what he said was right and true and best about my sexuality. I knew it. I just didn't want anything to do with it. And so in fear, I took control. And it was a fear of missing out. It was a desire for connection. And it went all the way to my senior year of high school, where my girlfriend, she sent me to CVS to buy a pregnancy test for her. And you know what that feels like as an 18-year-old kid standing in line with a box of pregnancy tests on the counter, not knowing if you're going to be a dad or not at 18. Feels like a storm, doesn't it? Turns out I had no control of the situation. She wasn't pregnant, somehow by God's grace, but then this played out in my marriage. When Ashley and I got married, I was terrified of having kids. And a lot of that fear came from what I'd experienced, the life I'd chosen to live through high school, where I was like, man, pregnancy is going to out me. It's going to show that I can't align my life to God. And so I didn't want to have kids. I just said no. I took control. And some of our worst fights as a couple, they happened as I tried to take control of the situation. You know what it felt like? Another storm, right? And then throughout my work life, most of it's been in ministry as a pastor. And I don't know about you. I don't know how work goes for you, but man, I constantly battle feeling like I'm not enough. Like that there's stuff in front of me that I'm like, I'm not sure how this is going to work out. I'm not sure how this is going to go, but God, surely you could have found somebody better than me to try to lead this church or try to do this. I feel like I'm not enough. My response is like Jonah, though, in those situations. I don't actually run away. I actually power up and I go, I'm going to hang on. I'm going to do this my way, God. If you're not going to show up the way that I think you should, I'll take control, God. And I start to act like I know all the answers. I'll make sure that my point is heard in meetings, or I'll go, man, I've got to work harder at preaching, or I just got to work harder. Anybody, when you're facing a situation at work, you just go, I got to power through this. I got to work harder. I try to stay busy. But you know what the result in my life has played out to be? Man, overwhelming anxiety, and at times exhaustion. And you know what that feels like? It feels like a storm. And I'm pretty sure it does at times to people around me too. And then at home, I mean, we've got 3 kids that are 7 and under, and I'd like to think that we can control things pretty well. But life is just out of control. I mean, our kids, they color on the walls with markers, right? And they poop in places that they're not supposed to poop, and then they get sick. Ashley was actually supposed to host and do announcements. They get sick, and they have to go home early. We have no control, right? We have no control. But you know what I do? Man, I try to white knuckle it. And I try to hold on to things so tightly and keep control. And in conflict, I'll yell louder so that it's heard, right? I'll yell louder and get angry so that people will know I'm actually the one that's in control. You know what fear does beneath the surface? It actually manifests itself as anger. Like we will mask fear with anger to try to keep control. And you know what that feels like to my wife and kids when I get that way? It feels like a storm. And in the middle of a storm, it's when you realize, man, I have no control. Does any of that sound familiar to your life? See, fear has a way of tricking us into believing the lie that we actually have control. And in that moment, that's when the storm hits. And for Jonah, what we're going to find is that's actually the best thing that could happen to his life. And it's the best thing that can happen to our lives when the storm hits, because it's the one thing that leads to us realizing we are not in control. So in the middle of the storm, back to Jonah's story, on the ship to Tarshish, as you can imagine, everybody's like freaking out. The storm is hitting, the ship is going to sink, except for Jonah. He's actually sleeping at the bottom of the ship, which is interesting because everybody else, remember, they're praying to their version of God, whatever they believe to be true about God. And Jonah is the one that actually believes the one true God and could ask that God to help. He actually knows what's going on, but he's down below the ship sleeping. And so all the sailors on the ship, they kind of figure out, like, maybe this dude Jonah knows something that's going on here. And so they put 2 and 2 together, and they realize that he's running away from God, and that's why the storm is happening. And they're like, dude, what the heck are you doing right now? And Jonah, get this, he tells them, hey, just throw me into the ocean. Just throw me into the ocean because I am better off dead and you are better off without me. Which, again, think about it. That's a way to try to take control. What has God said to Jonah? Has he said, Jonah, I want to kill you? No, he said, Jonah, I want you to go to Tarshish, right? So Jonah's trying to take control of the situation again. And then this crazy thing happens. The sailors, they throw Jonah into the ocean, and as soon as he hits the water, the storm stopped. It was done, which led to all the sailors on the ship coming to believe God, which when Jonah lost control, God actually accomplished what he wanted to through Jonah anyway. You see that? Jonah didn't even have control of it. Meanwhile, Jonah has something even crazier happening because he's sinking through the water. He's thinking he's going to die. I'm guessing he probably couldn't swim, but then this happened. It says that the Lord provided. Hold on to that word for a minute. He provided a huge fish to swallow Jonah, and Jonah was in the belly of the fish for 3 days and 3 nights. Now, pause for a second, because my guess is some of us, man, we just check out right there. A story of a man being eaten by a fish and he stayed alive for 3 days, like, it sounds crazy, right? And some of us, we hear stories like this and we're like, man, that's why I don't believe the Bible. That's why I stopped going to church, because things like that, it couldn't actually happen. If that's you, I want to ask you to hang with me for a minute, okay? Even if you don't believe that this physically could be true, The point that God is making through Scripture here, and the point that Jonah would be sharing with us through his own story is this, that when we're faced with fear, when Jonah was faced with fear of going to Nineveh and he tried to take control, it actually led to a place where he had no control. And the same thing's true in our lives. It was in that place for Jonah, in the belly of the fish, that Jonah was actually able to step into something different. Jonah was actually able to step into self-control. When he was completely broken, and when he had lost all control, when he had lost all hope, that's the place where Jonah actually gained self-control. And remember our definition of self-control. Self-control goes like this. It's a steadfastness and composure and self-mastery that goes beyond our circumstances. And Jonah's circumstances, they kind of suck right now, don't they? Like to say that lightly. Like they're not great circumstances. But what Jonah does in this moment is he gains steadfastness, composure, and self-mastery that exceed all of his circumstances. I mean, isn't that just how it kind of seems to work in life? I mean, are some of the most self-controlled people that you know people who have seemingly lost all control? You know, maybe it's an addiction overcome. Or maybe it's a diagnosis or a marriage or a job lost. But when facing fear, letting go of control, or in Jonah's case, losing control, because sometimes God will do that. When we think we have control, he'll just pull it all away from us, right? Losing control, it's actually what leads to self-control. And here's why I think that is. Because the difference between control and self-control is grace. The difference between control and self-control is grace. See, self-control is something you can't do. You can't produce it on your own. You can't make it in yourself. You can't will it or work harder at it. It's a fruit of the Spirit. And a fruit of the Spirit, like we've talked about throughout this series, it only comes by God's grace, by his undeserved favor in your life. Grace is a Bible word, and it's something external. You can't get it from yourself. And you can't control it, and you can't buy it, and you can't earn it. It actually just comes from God. Grace means this. It means being given what you need, not what you deserve. It means being given what you need, not what you deserve. And then grace goes on to give you the power to live a changed life. See, in facing fear or anger or sadness or whatever it is that tempts us to take control of our own lives, the difference between control and self-control is God's undeserved favor. It's grace. See, in Jonah, we get a glimpse of this grace. Maybe we get more than a glimpse. It was at Jonah's lowest point that he had lost all control, that he was able to step in and experience God's grace. God did what? He provided. He provided a fish so Jonah didn't die. See, sin, we're promised through Scripture, it leads to death. God goes, Jonah, I don't want you to die. I'm going to give you grace. I'm going to provide what you need, not what you deserve. And I'm going to give you the power in that moment to let go of control. And then Jonah, he prays this awesome prayer in chapter 2 of Jonah. And I would tell you, write this down. This is homework this week. Go read the prayer that Jonah prayed in Jonah chapter 2. It's this amazing prayer of letting go of control. And if you're facing a storm in life, or if you're facing somewhere where you feel like I've got to control everything, or life feels out of control, man, go read Jonah chapter 2. And I think it'll just encourage you in the middle of whatever storm it is that you're facing. See, like Jonah, as we learn to let go of control, or maybe we lose all control, we have to experience God's grace for us. And it's from that place that we can actually begin to step into self-control. A steadfastness or a composure, a self-mastery that exceeds our circumstances. And that's what Jonah started to do in the belly of this fish. Just in case you didn't think the story could get any weirder, then this happens. The Lord commanded the fish, and it vomited Jonah up on the shore. I mean, around my house, I've got young kids, so we tell a lot of potty jokes. This is how I know God has a sense of humor, that he said the fish vomited. That's how he chose to communicate this to us. Moving on, all right? You got a good visual there? Then the word of the Lord came to Jonah a second time. Go to the great city of Nineveh and proclaim to it the message I give you. And Jonah did what this time? He obeyed the word of the Lord, and he went to Nineveh. And here's the message God gave to Jonah. 40 more days and Nineveh will be overthrown. Real encouraging, right? Let's be honest here. That took some self-control, didn't it? I mean, that took some, guts from Jonah. Because remember, this is Nineveh. They skin their enemies, and they play Tetris with their heads, right? And Jonah goes and he goes, 40 more days and you'll be overthrown. He's telling them somebody's going to threaten your empire. What did Nineveh do to people in these situations? They typically killed them, right? If I were Jonah, I would have sugarcoated this a little bit. I would have tried to protect myself. I would take back control of this situation. But Jonah, I mean, you got to think about it. He spent 3 days in the belly of a fish. He's hit rock bottom. He's seen what it's like to lose all control, to realize that he doesn't have control, and he's experiencing grace. He's gotten what he needed from God, not what he deserved. And so now he's stepping into the power that comes from grace. He's stepping into self-control for the good of Nineveh and to the glory of God. And you can read the rest of the story for yourself in Jonah chapter 3, but the craziest thing happened. It says in Jonah 3, verse 5, that the Ninevites believed God. Like they heard Jonah say this, and they believed God as a result of Jonah letting go of control and stepping into self-control and just letting God do his thing. And again, that's God's grace showing up all over the story. Not just for Jonah, but for the Ninevites as well. See, God's a God of second chances and third chances and fourth chances and 100th chances. See, God's grace is for all people at all times to get to experience him. God wants all people to come to experience his grace. I mean, wouldn't it have been easy for Jonah just to take back control again and change his message? It wouldn't have been easy for the Ninevites to take control and just kill Jonah, but they didn't. See, grace, God's undeserved favor, it actually paved the way from control to self-control for both Jonah and the Ninevites in this story. Now, don't you wish the story just ended right there with a nice, neat bow on it? And it said, they all lived happily ever after, because it feels resolved, right? But that's not how life works. Because in chapter 4, what we're going to find, if you flip on in your Bibles, Jonah moves right back into his same old ways. He actually wants to control the situation again, and he goes outside of Nineveh, and we get the idea that maybe he wasn't fully on board with God to begin with, so he goes out and he sits down outside, and he throws this little temper tantrum on the ground like my kids do when they're mad. He goes, God, I knew you'd give them grace, like he's complaining that God gave grace to somebody. And he goes, I knew you'd be compassionate. God, I would rather die than see Nineveh be saved. I mean, think about that. He's a little dramatic, right? And even still, God is showing Jonah grace by providing a plant to shade him from the hot sun. And he's showing Jonah the same compassion that he gives to you and me, that he's given to Nineveh. See, God's grace is for all people at all times. For Nineveh, we understand that through history, letting go of control, it's only temporary. It didn't last long, because 37 years later, they took back control, and they took up their violent ways again, and they ended up going and invading and destroying the northern kingdom of Israel. And Jonah, he's throwing this little temper tantrum, and that's where the story ends. That's all we know. Now, as weird as this sounds, the story gives me a lot of hope. Here's why. Because ending on a kind of a down note without a nice, neat bow on the end, doesn't that sound like your story? Sounds an awful lot like my life. Whenever I face fear and I try to take control, or I let go, or I lose control, what happens is God comes and he gives me grace. He gives me his undeserved favor. He gives me the power to step into self-control. But guess what happens? Eventually I try to take control again. And eventually I realize that I don't have it and I lose it again. It's this cycle again and again and again. Does that sound like anybody's life? Yeah, me too. And that's the tension of grace. That's the tension of grace. It's the tension of living in this life that God is constantly moving in our direction. He's constantly giving us what we need, not what we deserve. We've said it around here through this series this way: growth takes time. So if you're going, man, I'm not seeing this self-control coming in my life very easily, man, give yourself some grace. Growth takes time. Here's another thing I love about this story. A lot of people believe that Jonah maybe was the author of his own story, of his own book. Which, if that's true, think about it. It means that he chose to end his own story not for Jonah's glory, right? But for God's glory. By pointing to the grace of God. He chose to point out his own weakness and God's strength. He chose to make God the hero of the story. And you know what that takes? You know what it takes to point to God and go, it's all him, it's not me? Self-control, right? And that only happens by God's grace. In fact, 830 years later, Jesus pointed back to Jonah's story as a prediction of his own death and resurrection to bring grace to the world. You can read about it in Matthew chapter 12. But Jesus compared his own death and his own resurrection to Jonah spending 3 days and 3 nights in the belly of the fish. I mean, think about that. The moment that Jonah chose to run from God, the moment of Jonah's greatest fear and his greatest failure, the moment where Jonah tried to take control and God stripped it away from him. That's the story that Jesus chose to use to describe how he would bring grace to the entire world. I mean, pretty cool, huh? And so here's the question we're left with in Jonah's story. What does it look like? What does it look like to live out of self-control instead of attempting to take control? What does it look like to live out of self-control instead of attempting to take control? See if any of these things resonate with you. When it comes to fear in our lives or anger or sadness or anything else that tempts us to take control, we can respond to these things in a few ways. The first one is this. We can try to take control of the situation, right? We can go, like, I've got this. This plays out in Jonah's story and it plays out in my story over and over. We start manipulating people and situations in order to control the fear and control the outcome, right? And we do it our own way, on our own terms, and for our own good. Or we do like Jonah did at the end of the story, and we go, man, this is just out of control. This is out of control. I throw up my hands. I'm going to give up. I'm overwhelmed, and I shut down. This is what Jonah did because the outcome of Nineveh was out of his control. So he walked outside, and he goes, I wish I was dead, and we just give up, right? Anybody ever been there? But God actually offers us a better way to step into self-control. And it's here that we admit that, God, you have this under control. You have this under control. This is what we should do with our fear in the kingdom of God. We don't take control of the situation, and we don't trick ourselves into thinking that it's completely out of control. No, instead, we go, hey, God, you promised me you've got this under your control. And we place it in his hands. We believe that he'll take care of us by his grace. And through grace, we step into self-control. See, self-control only comes as we realize that God has it under control. But what does this look like practically? I want to challenge you this week to take a few steps. I want to take a few steps together to start to apply this and live it out. I want to challenge us to put self-control into practice. So let's start here. What are you afraid of? What are you afraid of? Where's an area of your life where you're being asked to do something you don't want to do? Or do you have fear? Or where are you afraid of what the outcome might be? Or if you don't know what that is, where's an area of life where you just feel like you're trying to hang on? You're trying to over-control the situation, or life just feels out of control. Where are you white-knuckling it, trying to keep everything together? Or where are you just ready to give up? That's probably an area where fear is popping up for you. And so here's what I want to challenge us with this week. There's no 3-step program to self-control. Wouldn't that be nice? Self-control is a work of God in our lives. So it's literally taking that area of life to God and saying, God, it's under your control. I give it up to you. And then here's the kicker. Act on whatever he tells you to do next. Act on whatever he tells you to do next. See, that's self-control. And it doesn't happen by accident. As the Apostle Paul said, it's a fruit of the Spirit. It's a fruit of God's work in your life, and it's learning to keep in step with the Holy Spirit, to lay it all before God and trust that he actually has this thing called our lives in this world under his control, and then we act on whatever he tells us to do next. I want to invite you for a minute. Look around. Literally look around the room. You're not the only one in here that goes through what you go through. We are all in the same boat around here at Hope City. We are people who face fear, and we try to take control. And for some of us, life just feels out of control, doesn't it? But man, that's the tension of grace. God says, I've got this good news for you, that I'm going to give you my undeserved favor in your direction. I'm going to show you I have this under my control. And by letting God have control, he promises us this fruit of self-control. And if you don't have it yet, man, give yourself some grace. Growth and fruit, they take time, don't they? Growth, it just takes time, and we don't do it perfectly. But we follow one who does. And that's Jesus. He's gone before us, and when he was faced with death to bring grace to the world, he felt fear too. In the garden, before he went to the cross, Jesus prayed, God, if there's any other way, please, there's got to be something else. If there's a way for you to take this away from me, just do it. See, Jesus was even tempted with a sense of control. But instead, he gave us a perfect example of what it looks like to have self-control. He goes, Father, it's not what I want, but your will be done. In essence, he's going, God, I know you have this under your control. And then he showed the greatest act of self-control this world will ever know. He went to the cross, he stretched out his arms, and he died. But the story doesn't end there, does it? Because he came back from the grave. And if a man predicts his own death and resurrection and actually pulls it off, like I'm pretty sure that's a surefire way that you can look at him and go, yeah, he's got it under control, right? He's got it under control. So we're going to enter into a time that we do every week called a time of prayer. And this is an opportunity just for you to reflect on what maybe God is teaching you right now. Like, what are you afraid of? What are you afraid of? Or where are you trying to control life? Or where does life feel out of control? And what would it look like in these next few minutes just to place that before Jesus and go, Jesus, you've got it under control. You've got it under control. And also in this time, we're going to pass communion. It's a little piece of bread and a cup of juice. It's a tangible reminder that Jesus went before us, that he demonstrated self-control to give us grace. The difference between control and self-control is grace. And we get to be reminded every single week that we get to live in his grace. And that's the power that leads us into a changed life. So let me pray for us, and then these next few minutes are yours.